Now, you talk about stereotypes. The stereotype that the Middle Ages was a really violent period. I'm sure you know that one. That's what Hollywood movies are all about. And people just assume that it was a more violent period than our own. Um, a publisher asked me to write a book about it. So I started poking around and I found out some very interesting things. It's really hard to get homicide statistics that long ago because very few people were keeping them. But what images we can get say that on an absolute level, when you're talking about body count, the Middle Ages weren't any more violent than today. I would say that modern New York or Moscow or maybe Paris are more dangerous places than 13th century England. Um, yeah. No, what's responsible for the stereotype, the way I like to put it, is people in the Middle Ages were differently violent. And let me explain what that means. Again, you're in a world where there's no such thing as a state. You have kings, but they're nowhere near as powerful as modern states. That only starts to happen towards the end of the Middle Ages. For much of the Middle Ages, kings are big men. They're just a little bit bigger than everybody else, but they don't have anything like the state with its police force and its prisons and whatnot. Which means, in terms of local conflict, people have to figure out how to handle it themselves. And so you can see, going way back, even almost into the Roman period, a set of local ways of handling dispute that rested on one fundamental idea. Every man, every free man, and we're not talking about slaves or serfs, and we're certainly not talking about women, unfortunately. Every free man had the right to use violence on his own behalf. Okay. To defend himself, to defend his family, to defend his property, to defend his friends, his kin, but also to defend his honor, his reputation. Okay. Well, that would seem to be a recipe for chaos, but it's not, because there are mechanisms that tamp it down. If, let's say, we're living before the year 1000 in what's now France, I kill your brother. Okay. You have not only the right, but the duty to take vengeance on me. So, if I'm mad at your brother, I'm going to be making some cost benefit calculations. Taille is going to come after me if I do this. How strong is Taille? How many friends has he got? Is this worth it? Okay. So that threat right there tends to keep things under control. And so when homicide does happen, the threat of vengeance immediately makes me think, okay, either I have to run away, okay, I become outlawed, I run away from the community, or I have to fight back, which means I have to check and make sure my family and friends are willing to back me up. If they don't, if they didn't like what I did, then I have to buy you off somehow. And so what you see are very sophisticated compensation regimes where people work out by law how much I owe you for killing your brother. And that amount covers not just whatever material losses. Okay, yeah, your brother can't work the farm anymore because he's dead. It also covers the insult, the damage to your honor. It hurts me enough that you feel satisfied. And you get these things written up in law. Okay. The different amounts for different injuries, different amounts for different categories of people. And so what you get is a world that on the surface looks more violent because people are using violence in ways and in contexts that we wouldn't. We call that sort of thing now vigilante justice, and we don't like it. Okay. But in a more local world with weak state power, where everybody knows each other, and I know how many friends and kin you've got, I know how prestigious you are, I know how much it would hurt me to get crossways with you. There are all sorts of ways of negotiating, using threat, using the threat of force, occasionally displaying force. Supposing I did something that the community thought was just really horrible. Okay, I raped your sister. You come after me and you chop my head off. And you leave me in the center of town to show the whole world that you did it. The community very likely thinks that I had it coming. And you have displayed how ready you are to take vengeance, which means that the next time, nobody's going to mess with you. There are ways of settling disputes, threatening violence, using violence, but also negotiation, compromise, that look completely foreign to us, even scary, because like I said, it smacks of vigilante justice. But it works very well when you don't have a state with a police force coming in and enforcing things. So my sense is, and the argument that I made in this book, is that for much of the Middle Ages, we think the period was more violent because people were being violent differently than we would accept. But the body count probably wasn't any higher. And what happens when kings start to get really powerful and start to try to monopolize violence for themselves, the killing shifts from between you and me to the king doing it. Okay? It becomes the right of the English king to execute somebody for homicide. Okay? Well, that's the state taking vengeance when earlier it would have been you or me. So it's a really alien world. And that one is hard to convince people of because the stereotype is just so entrenched that this is a wildly violent world. I had a conversation at a dinner party with somebody who asked about my work, and I told them, and they just would not have it. No, the Middle Ages were, you took your life in your hands by walking out the front door. And I'm like, well, no, if I walk out the front door and somebody attacks me, the first thing I want to know as an investigator is what did I do to his sister? Or how did I insult him? Or, what's going on? It's a world that ran by different rules. That one is going to be harder to get out there, but I wrote the book on purpose in a very accessible way. I used sources that are translated into English. I wanted the book to get into classrooms. I wanted people like you to read it. To get people, it's one of the things that's most important to me as an historian, is to get people to change the lenses in their glasses. Too many people look at the past as an extension of the present. Either they thought just like we did, or it's a bad world because they didn't think like we do and they should have. To try to get people to really step inside the heads of people who really understood the world very differently than we do. I think that's the greatest challenge of being an historian and one of the things that I think is most important. Because if you can do that, then you can convince people, well, all right, I'll look around the world today. I'll look at what's going on in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Palestine, or wherever. And maybe I won't be so quick to assume that they think like I do. And maybe I'll try to understand them on their own terms too.